similar to this shape here. The thing is the names aren't exact. And one of the things about patterns in computer programming that people don't really realize is names don't have to be exact in order for you to figure out that it's the same pattern. For example, subjects. So in subjects, if I'm here and I go and I get some, document body or something like that, we have add event listener, and I can, add event listener for click. And guess what? This here, document body in this case, is technically a subject, and my observer is just a function. So if you can kind of bend this quite a bit. This is the pattern. Like the difference between passing in an object with a method on it that gets called and passing in a function that gets called is pretty much nothing, honestly. An object allocation at most. So just something to consider, that the observer pattern itself is everywhere. So let's talk really quick about the subject. So the subject has an interface of, well, let's go to the letter here. It's got like a notify observers. And mostly in this actual design here, it doesn't have a value, but you could pass a value to it. So let's do that. We'll just say that we're going to pass a value of p. And then the other thing is it has a register observer, and you can pass an observer to it. Let's make an observer interface. Again, I'll get to how this applies to RxJS in just a bit. An observer has like a notify on it. It's a value in this case. And then, why is this complaining? Oh, it's complaining because there's no return type. Void. And then this is also void, and this will say unregister observer. Wait, all right. So here we've got this whole subject business and observer. So we've got an observer pattern. You would define some sort of subject, you'd be able to pass observers to it and whatever. Now, here's the thing about this. We have an observer in RxJS, but we don't have a notify method. What we have is a next method. And if you look at these two functions here, by signature, they are pretty much the same thing. And if it's not, by the way, if it's not apparent to you, the purpose of this with register observer, notify observers, and whatever, the purpose of a subject is you register however many observers you like with it. 1, 2, 3, however many, maybe none. And then when you call notify observers, it notifies all the observers that have been registered with the subject, and you can remove them by unregistering them, right? So back to our observer, this was called notify, and I changed it to be called next because it's just a name. That doesn't really matter. But if you notice, next value of t, notify value of t, like this is the same function with a different name. So if I rename it, now we actually have a subject that really extends observer, right? It's the same. We don't even need to have this on there anymore. I'll keep it there just so we can see, but it has a next method just like observer, so that it is an observer at this point. Now, in RxJS, we have a type with an object that, or with a method that takes observer, and that type is observable. So if I had an observable interface, the simplest possible observable interface has a subscriber or a subscribe method that takes an observer, right, and it returns a subscription. How to push subscription. A subscription. The subscription is this relatively dumb object that just has an unsubscribe. Void. Right, so this is a basic observable. No pipe or anything fancy on it. This is the required shape to make a limited observable. If you look again, we're in a situation where, just like we changed these, subscribe and register observer are really almost the same function with a different name. The only reason it's almost is we have this subscription on here, right? But what if we said, well, hey, maybe instead of having this unregistered observer, we actually say, well, we can return a subscription here such that when you call unsubscribe, it essentially does what it would have done with unregistered observer and the observer instance that was passed in here, because you have all that state, right? So now we have a function that's essentially the same shape. So instead of having unregistered observer, we have this unsubscribe that gets returned that we can use. And all we have to do to make this an observable now is just change this to subscribe. And now we've got an object that is both an observer and an observable. And of course, an observer in Rx has these other features: error, complete, etc. Now, the purpose of a subject per this actual observer pattern is to multicast. And what I mean by multicast is this: like, you normally, if you're notifying somebody, you're notifying, like, a notification comes in, and if there's one observer, you just observe it. It's the only thing that observes. Now, if you have a notification come in to a subject, the subject can have multiple observers, where it's actually coming up here and notifying this observer, and then going down here and notifying this observer, and so on, right? So we're actually able to split. And this is called multicasting. So I'm taking one notification. So if there's a notification coming in here, and I'm splitting it out to where it's actually able to notify more than one observer. So that's the whole purpose of a subject. And actually, that is the primary purpose of a subject in RxJS. So I'm going to get to the actual implementation and usage real first, but at a very high level, the principle of subjects comes from the observer pattern, which is something you use all over the place, all the time, and probably don't really realize it. And we've just kind of adapted it such that we have this subject type that is both an observer and an observable. So it can do both. Let me look over here and see if there's any questions. Looks like we're doing good. I'll check back in a little bit. No worries. All right, so interesting things about subjects. If a subject is both an observer and an observable, and I'm gonna, now at this point, I'm gonna pull in RxJS. What we can do is you can take it and you can kind of multicast. Actually, I'm going to bring in an interval. And we'll do take, so we don't have an endless interval. If I have this observable source, and what it is just an interval that counts from 0 to infinity to start with, fires once every half a second, let's say. And we only want to take 10 values of it. So this is values 0 through 9. And I subscribe to it. And I subscribe to it with an observer that I will create. Most basic of observers. You know it's a number in this case, so I'm kind of cheating. But if I subscribe to it, I can go in here and it's pumps these values out. Let me make sure the console clears. It puts these values out, and I've observed it one time. Let me take this and say make it a little faster so it doesn't take so long. There we go. And we'll just do like 5 values. All right. Now, here's the thing about this. If I was to later on set a timeout, so we wait, oh, I will make this a little bit longer again. If I wait a full second and subscribe to this again, what you'll notice is the results are kind of mixed. And so I can make this a little bit more obvious. I'm going to have a function that creates an observer, so we can give it a name. And I will just say name value there. So this one will be A. This will be observer B. You see, B started the entire interval all over again. Like, in fact, this whole thing started again. I'm even going to make a new observable source instead of this. Let's go new observable subscriber, just so we can see a little bit more what's going on. And ID equals set interval. We go every half a second. And then make sure this is refreshed. There we go. So now I've got this brand new observable source, and it is still in an interval of every half a second. It's going to update this number and emit it. Let's say this is an observable number. And after it's done it, oh, this is wrong. I think I wrote the library. After it's done it, say 5 times, let's have it complete. Refresh so we can see it. So you can see what's happening here is it's actually starting a new observable. And one of the reasons I did this is so I can actually show you that we're subscribing to a brand new observable. Every single time. This observable is quote unquote cold. So you can see we've started twice. And what happens if I want to multicast that? Well, we can get back to our subject. If I have a subject that's both an observer and an observable, and the observable side of it is literally just registering a list of internal observers that it's notifying, it just loops over them and notifies them all, then I can use a subject to make sure that I only ever subscribe to this thing one time. And how I would do that is I would create a new subject, be a subject of number in this case, because I know that's what's coming out of here. And I'm going to actually use this subject to subscribe to it. But first, I want to subscribe to my subject instead with these observers. And I will say source subscribe subject. So it started, and you can see now I'm actually sharing results. Even though B joined later on, like it never started another one. I'm actually sharing those two. I'm multicasting this one observable to 2 different observers simultaneously. And the reason is that same sort of thing I was showing earlier, where I've got one observable source of notifications coming in, and it's hitting the subject, which is able to multicast to different observers, right? In this case, it's only doing it to 2 technically, but we got observer A here, and then down here, we're gonna have observer B that joins later. So that's the entire purpose of a subject. Let me jump to questions and see if there's any. Looks like we're doing so good. If there's any questions during this, please feel free to post them here, and I'll jump into it. All right. So that's the basic ins and outs of a subject. If you were to try to develop a subject from scratch, I mean, it's a pretty simple thing. Like you wouldn't really want to do this and use it with Rx, but effectively, just so people can see it, what you have is you've got this private observers list, which is an observer subject T. And then you've got a subscribe, takes an observer. And of course, in RxJS, we take more than an observer. You can do a function or whatever, but just for simplicity's sake, you take an observer. And really what this is going to do is it's going to say, just push the observer on there. And it's going to return subscription and subscribe. It will remove this. So let's make this a little. So this would be this observer's index of observer. There's my tabbing all off on this. And this is my index. My index is greater than or equal to 0. We want to remove it. So this is effectively what a subject looks like. And then the next bit would be the nexting, where you'd have, okay, I've got some value. And every single time you get a value, what it's really doing is it's just saying observers for each observer. Now, this is a really, really primitive subject, and it's not perfect either, because we also have error, be anything, and we've got complete, could be anything. And these are going to do the same sort of thing. The exception of actually going to error and actually going to complete. Right? But this is still problematic, because if I call next on my custom subject here, my subject, and someone's already called error, it's still going to work. So we have the same guarantees for subjects that we do in RxJS that we do for every other subscriber in the library. So the subscriber that you get here, you're not allowed to call next after you call complete. I mean, you're allowed to, but it's a no-op. It won't do anything. So the same semantic is here, to where we would have this private is closed. And we'd check if this is closed. If it's not closed, go ahead and do that. And the same thing would happen here and here. The difference is these would actually close it. And there's other bits here, like you'd want to make sure that this, cleared the observers list or whatever to free up memory, so it wasn't just hanging on to stuff for no apparent reason, that sort of thing. There's also other weird gotchas that can happen with this that RxJS handles. For example, reentrancy. So interesting things about subjects. You can have a subject that subscribes to itself, technically. All you need is an instance of subject, and you can make an infinite loop where calling next on the subject causes it to next into itself if you want. because it's both an observer and an observable. This is actually a useful pattern for various things, but you don't want to do it with a totally synchronous observable, right? Like you wouldn't want to actually have a subject subscribe to itself directly and not do anything, because you just create an infinite loop and I'd lock this whole thing up. But let's just say that I was to do something else. Let me stop doing the rest of this really quickly. I'll just comment it out. See if there's any questions so far. I think we're good. All right. So aside from this class mySubject, we'll use the regular RxJS subject. You can do things like you can say my subject. I'll be lazy and just say any. I can say, well, what happens if I want to compose this with a simple delay, for example? I'm going to import that from the wrong spot. No, I got it. We'll delay it by a second. And then I subscribe to itself. Now, if I subscribe to itself, I can't get any other output here. So what I'll want to do a side effect is I'll use tap. And tap has the same thing where I can do next, error, and so on. I'm just going to go tap next, or even just supply the function to it. It's totally valid. Let's do that. Value console log value. So I have this subject, and so we don't get confused by this, I'm going to comment that out. This is all my code is right now, and you can see nothing's happening. But if I were to say, oh, let's make it so when I click the document, event listener, click. We actually pump in to our subject next now. So we get like a timestamp. If I do that, what we're going to see will be something unusual, because this is going to say, okay, I'm going to put this value into the subject. This is going to delay it, then display it, then take it and put it back into the same subject. So what we're going to get is some recursion. And it's going over and over again. And if I click again, see, now we've got two going. So this is kind of a way that you can create like a recursive loop inside of RxJS with a subject. It's kind of an interesting property of it. But this isn't really the use case of a subject. The primary use case is this multiplexing up here. Let's see if there's any questions. No? All right, so there's no questions about that. Let me dive back into the multiplexing example really quick. So I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to go back and uncomment my multiplexed stuff. So here, it's going to keep going forever. So here we're back into our multiplexing. Now, the thing about multiplexing is this is a cumbersome way to know to multiplex. Like, hold on, I got to create a subject. Like if I want to share this cold observable, if I want to make this cold observable, quote unquote, hot, and we can get into hot and cold if people are curious about that later. If I'm going to make this hot, if I'm going to multicast the output of this observable, like knowing the recipe of, oh, we have to create a subject and then you have to subscribe to it with a subject, but only after you've already subscribed to it with this other observer in case it synchronously emits something and yada, yada, yada. That's no bueno. That's like not the easiest thing in the world. So a long time ago, folks added an operator called publish. And what publish is it effectively is an operator that says, oh, I'm going to return a connectable observable that has this connect method on it. And the connectable observable, when you call connect, does this. It connects the source to the subject. So if I go up here and I say, here's my source, and I do pipe publish, Actually, let's start with multicast. They have multicast was the very first one. And you give it a new subject, any subject. In this case, you could give it this subject here. And now, instead of having to do this bit, we say, oh, let's subscribe to our source. And this is doing the identical thing, exact same thing. Under the hood, when you call subscribe to the source, what it's actually doing is subscribing to this subject, but it's not connected yet because this happens to be returned as a connectable observable. And the crappy thing is that this is an API that existed for a long time, and TypeScript does not like what we're doing here. So unfortunately, in TypeScript right now, you have to cast. And we've got answers for how we're going to improve this in version 8, where instead of having an operator to multicast that returns connectable, there'll be a creation function that is a little bit nicer for TypeScript. But you get this connectable observable, and instead of doing this, the identical, right down to the subscription that's returned, is you can say source connect. And this is what actually does the same work. So it's literally doing the same thing under the hood. It even returns the same subscription right here. And this subscription controls the connection between the subject, the interior subject that we passed in, and the source observable, which is everything above that multicast. So that's multicast. Now, it was decided that this was a bit silly. So this is exactly the same thing as this. So I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to leave the other one in there. Literally the same thing. So publish, and we don't need the new subject, sorry. Publish is the same thing as multicast new subject. Oop, let me pull that in. Let me refresh so we can see it. Same exact thing. Now, it was also deemed that most of the time having to know about this whole connection thing, especially in TypeScript with having to cast and all this stuff, is really annoying. We don't want to do that. So we've added yet another thing, which is called ref count. And a ref count operator is a special operator that you really only want to use after a publish, because it really only works with connectable observables. And we no longer care about this casting business. It's useless. And we don't need this connect anymore. So let me refresh this just so we can see it. And it's doing the same thing. But the difference is, what ref count says is, I'm going to keep a counter for how many observers I've got for this particular connectable observable. And when I get one subscription in, I'm going to connect it. And as long as I have one subscription, I'm going to keep it connected. But as soon as the subscription count drops to 0, which means everything is unsubscribed or taken what it wanted to and left, when that subscriber count drops to 0 and there are no more observers, it's going to disconnect. It's going to unsubscribe from the source. So it's going to disconnect the subject from that. And that means that you can just subscribe to it, and that'll start it going. And then subsequent subscriptions are still multicasting. So this is kind of like it's cold until you subscribe to it, and then all of a sudden it's hot, and it stays hot. And it's the same thing. So we've got publish ref count, which again is a weird recipe. It's kind of indecipherable. What does this mean to publish? What does this mean ref count? The other gotcha here is I'm passing in a new subject under the hood. And there's only one instance. We never do anything to renew that instance. And as I've stated in other lessons that we've done here, observers, of which subject is an observer in RxJS, or it's used as a subscriber, you cannot call next after you've called error or complete. So if I do a publish ref count and I wanted to do something like repeat it 3 times, repeat repeat it 3 times, this isn't going to work. And the reason it's not working is because this subject was completed, which means you can never call next on it again. So all of this is like this bit here is for nothing. And there was no way around that with publish ref count. So we actually added one new operator starting in RxJS 5 called share. And what share does is it effectively does publish ref count, with the exception of when the reference counter gets down to 0, it nukes the subject that was there and will create a new one when you subscribe to it again. So it basically means you're multicast, but you're able to resubscribe. So you can do things like retry and repeat. So if I replace these 2 things with share, you'll see exactly the same behavior, with the difference of it's repeating. You can see it repeat as soon as it's done. So we had it repeat 3 times. So all of that said, when you want to multicast an observable, meaning share the what's emitting with multiple observers, you just want to use share. It's got the least foot guns. You have to know the fewest recipes. Like this is the thing that you want to do. There are a couple gotchas about that I'll get to in a second. Let me check and see if there's any questions. Looks like we're okay. All right. So a few minor gotchas with share. Let's take this, and I'm just going to comment this out for a second, and I'm going to make a new source. And this source is going to be a completely synchronous observable. 1, 2, 3, 4. Pipe that through share. And what you're going to see here is, I'll even make these things subscribe simultaneously. Like we'll comment this out. So what you're going to see here is, oh wait, I thought that this was going to share these 2 things right away. In fact, I'll even hard code this in there so we can see it a little bit better. New observable subscriber. All right. So inside of here, I'm just going to say for 0 less than 4. Emit a bunch of numbers and then complete. Now, people will do this, like a totally synchronous observable like this, and they'll share it, and then they'll subscribe to it back-to-back synchronously, and they'll be like, wait, why did this go multiple times in a row? Or even more obviously, I put that start in here. Why did it start this observable twice? And the reason is that the first subscription comes in here, executes this synchronously, which synchronously loops and then completes. And then your reference count drops back to 0, renews the underlying subject, then you subscribe again, reference count goes up to 1, it connects, calls this subscribe, synchronously nexts into it and completes, reference count drops back down to 0. So if you're using completely synchronous observables and you want to share them, then you probably want to use multicast or publish with connect afterwards. And that looks like this, where you would say publish. And then right after this is all done, you'd say source connect. And it complained about the type, but it still worked. Where now I've actually shared it. So that's one of the reasons that this whole connect thing still exists, is in the rather unlikely event that you need to share the results from a completely synchronous observable, you need to kind of set up those connections first and then do this. Now, there's another way to get about doing this with publish that's slightly less obvious, where there's a mapping function inside here, and I don't really want to get that into that today, but I highly recommend people look into that because if you use a mapping function inside there, you don't have to use connect. What it is you can effectively do these two things inside of here, and then you basically get a shared observable, and then you're expected to return a new observable that you do something with. So maybe you like merge it or whatever. And at the end of this block, it connects whatever you did inside of here. So it's something worth looking at. But again, I don't really want to get into that today. We can do a whole thing about just that. But all right, let's see if there's any questions. Let's see. Bill says, can you please explain the difference between share versus replay versus share replay? All right. So replay, share replay uses under the hood what is called a replay subject. Now, a replay subject, let's see, what do I have going here? I'll just scroll down here. A replay subject looks like this. And it takes some arguments. You can pass nothing into it at all, or it takes like buffer size or how long you'd like the window to last, etc. But at the end of the day, what replay subject does is it says this. If I go in and I next a bunch of values into this, let's make this of any. I'm gonna go kill all this noise temporarily. If I say, although I will leave that observer helper because it was handy. I'm sorry, I'm scrolling around a lot. Let me just move all this back up to where I was working. I next a bunch of values into a replay subject. It actually keeps an internal cache. So here, such that when I subscribe to it, subscribe with the observer A. Notice all I did is subscribe, and this happened before my subscription. It replayed everything it had recorded. So there's an internal recorded set of notifications. Even if I was to error into this, my typing is kind of awkward today. You can see it went to here, and then it actually it's complaining that it's unwinding the stack and figuring out where that happened. But or complete, even if I was to complete it ahead of time, it's still playing back these values and then completing. So let me error handling to this error. Eat. See, we still got this in here. Again, I can go back to the error scenario. And it just replays it, even though I've already subscribed to it. If I kill that and I go here and then I next into this again later, it gets that as well, even if this arrives later on. So replay subject, it's the same after the initial subscription. It's identical to the other subject. The difference is it keeps like an internal cache such that when new subscribers arrive to it, it gets those internal values played back to it. So frequently what you'll find, especially when people are doing application development, is they'll have share replay. And so share replay is the same as share, but it's using a replay subject under the hood, and it's got a unique goal. And the unique goal with share replay was originally that you could have some sort of really expensive action. So let me go back to, let's create a different source. And I'll say that source is observable. It's just waiting for a number, but what it's actually going to do is wait. Maybe something takes a long time to get, like we'll make it take a full 2 seconds. And we get our value out. It's the meaning of life. Then it completes. So this is our observable source. And what happens is people will say, okay, well, this thing here, it takes forever to get. And I don't want to have to do that expensive action twice. I only want to have to do it one time, even if I decide I don't want it anymore and I unsubscribe from it, I still want this sucker to keep going because this was expensive, and so I want to cache it. So what we've got is this thing where we can say source type to share replay. And frequently you'll see people do share replay of 1. That just says that the inside cache has a size of 1. If you know it's only 1, it doesn't really matter. You can just do this. It's the same thing. But we'll say share replay of 1, and then they subscribe to it, right? I'm going to keep this shared. And they subscribe to it. Shared with observer A. And then a bit later, to set timeout, maybe the set timeout is a full 3 seconds later. We want to do the same thing, only with B. Let me refresh this so we can see it. So we wait 2 seconds, and then we get it back. But as soon as B goes to subscribe, you'll see it doesn't have to wait a full 2 seconds. It gets it back right away. And this is because even though this one was long done and cleaned up, it allowed the underlying source, this underlying source observable, to continue without tearing down, so that you wouldn't have to do the same expensive action twice. And that's the default of share replay. And it's one of the things that confuses people, because they will subscribe to it a whole bunch, and then they'll unsubscribe everybody from it and be like, why did my observable keep going? Like, why didn't teardown occur in here? And the reason teardown didn't occur as soon as you unsubscribed everybody is because the default behavior of share replay is to allow it to complete this expensive action. Now, there's a way to make this not do that. And one of the ways to make this not do that is to pass in this configuration object, which has ref count true. And actually, I think it's just a configuration object on its own. And if you pass in ref count true, then what you'll see, let me refresh so you can see this again, is when that reference counter gets down to 0, it'll actually start this whole thing again. Let me add this. Oh, am I wrong about this? Oh my gosh, I don't know my own library. Ref count true. Now that should do it. Is it because this one isn't done? Sorry, folks. This is a newer feature, and I might be lying to you. So in this case, since we did allow it to complete, that's the case. However, that's right. If I was to like right after this, unsubscribe. So just to be clear, if the first pass through this completes, it will keep the underlying state so you don't have to do it again, regardless of the ref counting. However, if you have ref counting set to true, if all subscribers unsubscribe, it will abort whatever action it had underway by calling teardown. And then the very next subscription, it will start it all over again. But once it completes, with shared replay, it completes, and that's it, because it's share replay is what you want to use if you have an expensive action that you don't want to execute twice. So if you're loading like a huge amount of data for your view, or you're loading some application-wide cache or something, and you want it in an observable for whatever reason, you would use share replay. In all honesty, I don't recommend it for that sort of long-term caching. In my opinion, what you should probably do in those cases is just execute an observable, never unsubscribe, and take the state and stuff it in a variable that you can access synchronously later on. It's a little bit more code, and maybe it doesn't compose quite as nicely, but in all honesty, you can do the same sort of thing with promises. You can have a promise that's already resolved, keep it like some sort of cache, and then use it like a cache. Super inefficient to do that. Much better to just, if there's state you want to access later and you want to access it quickly, stuff it in a variable and pull it out. That's what variables are for. All right. So, all right. Okay, are there any other questions? So this stuff is where it does get a little complicated. The thing, if you walk away from this with anything at all, let me stop sharing my screen. If you walk away from this with anything at all, I would say the important bit is to know to use share. Most of the time you just want to use share. There are a few cases where you might want to use share replay or something like that. But know that under the hood, everything is using a subject. But most of the time, when you just want to multicast an observable, you're going to use share. I've seen people use replay subject, especially in the Angular community. I think there's a lot of advice that tells people, oh, you make this HTTP request, and then you use a share replay on it or whatever. You probably just wanted to use share. More than likely, what you wanted to do was take the value out, stuff it in some state, and access it later if it was really that important to you. You probably most likely you just wanted to use share. To be dead honest, share replay does work for other instances where you want to use share, but you might have things joining the feed late. So you want to get those values coming in. Share replay is useful for other things like, a long-running WebSocket or something like that, and you want to be able to say, oh, well, this other component that joined needs to get the last 10 values that have arrived on the WebSocket so it can calculate some graph or whatever. That's a pretty common use case for share replay. But at the end of the day, that's the major difference between the two. And share replay is admittedly very confusing because people don't understand the goals. And the goals, as they were handed to me for share replay, were I need something such that when I have a very expensive asynchronous action, I don't have to execute it more than once. And that's why share replay sort of exists. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Hopefully I get to do some more of these. I think this is my last one, but it's a lot of fun. And hopefully everybody learned a bit about subjects today. Thanks.